Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Songwriters on Process podcast. My name is Benno Papari, and since 2010, I've run the Songwriters on Process website, where you can find more than 200 conversations with songwriters about the creative process. I'm not here to talk about tour stories, band drama, how a band got its name, or favorite foods. My goal is to treat songwriters as writers, plain and simple. This is an intelligent conversation about the writing process between two writers. And today's interview is with John Russell from The Head and the Heart. The Head and the Heart have a new album out April 29th called Every Shade of Blue. And a couple of things that stood out from this interview. One, I started this site in 2010. So at this point, there are over 200 interviews with songwriters on the site. And my favorite interviews are those where I get responses I've never heard before, truly original answers. I got a lot of those with this one, with Russell. So that was a cool part of it. The other thing is that when I started this site, my goal was to treat songwriters, as I say in my intro. My goal has always been to treat songwriters the same way that we treat more traditional writers, novelists, playwrights, poets, things like that, just as writers, plain and simple. And there's one thing that he said to me in the interview that really reflects, I think, how Russell sees himself as a writer. And he says, and I'm going to quote him directly, reading other authors and the way that they write is more rehabilitating than listening to other people's music. If I'm not writing, I'm reading. And notice he didn't say if I'm not writing, I'm listening to music. It was if I'm not writing, I'm reading. As you'll hear, we talk a lot about authors in this interview. The other thing, and this comes up a lot as a theme, and it's one of those answers I'd never heard before. Russell loves lists. He makes lists of everything. So bear with me on this. He loves lists, and he says he likes lists because he likes structure. And this also goes in some point in the interview. He talks about how he loves to clean the house, and he says, "Clean kitchen, happy brain." So there's that structure, right? That he likes, but he loves lists. But here's why he likes, and lists obviously have to do with structure. And in the songwriting process, he says, "I'd like to have structure so that I can let the chaos rule." Isn't that interesting? He says, as long as I have boundaries set up, I will allow myself to play like a 5-year-old. And so he needs the structure, but the structure allows him to have a chaotic writing process. And you'll hear that a lot as a theme throughout the interview. But again, I just want to go back to that idea. He's just very dialed in with his responses. When I ask these questions, he has answers, and these are not your boilerplate answers to my questions. He just knows his process like the back of his hand and knows exactly what works for him. And for some people that may be effective, others it may not be. And that's not a value judgment, but he just really knows exactly what works. And so when you hear these responses, that was me snapping my fingers. He knows what they are. He knows what the responses are immediately. He's got an answer for it. So that's why I think this is a good interview to listen to if you're a writer of any kind, because he has a very specific process. So anyway, I enjoyed this a lot. One more. He says, "I like to have structure to let the chaos loose." And he says he writes about, I think he said a dozen or 24 drafts of everything. And so he's got an extensive revision process. So I hope you enjoy. And with that, let's listen to my interview with Jonathan Russell of The Head and the Heart. So I always start by asking, how much writing are you doing outside of songwriting? Are you a journaler? Do you like to, just any other types of writing besides songwriting?
I do. None of it's ever very consistent, which is an ongoing nag that I have in my own head. But for the most part, Well, daily, I'm like a list maker, whether it's just to, I don't know if we're considering lists as you're writing, but we'll get to, trust me, it's relevant.
Yeah.
But I think it really, I guess writing for me, whether it's a list or morning pages or a song or poetry, they all seem to stem from when I become aware that I am anxious. I think there's like a certain amount of anxiety that and probably all of us sort of tolerate until we realize that we actually are anxious or have anxiety. And I've always felt very fortunate that I found an outlet. Some people, it might be something more physical. But for me, it was always writing. Ever since I was like preteen, I would be writing poems to my real or maybe not so real girlfriends at the time,
right.
or just nature in general. I've always thrown myself into the woods or any kind of scenario that's closest by. And I think seeing parallels between nature and ourselves was always a very calming experience. It just sort of gives you a bigger picture of like cycles and how what you're going through is not unique. And that somehow actually puts you at ease.
Right.
But to answer your original question, I'll go through phases, like I said, and like, have you ever heard of morning pages? It's
I have.
part
Yeah,
of the
you're
whole,
not
like, artist
many.
way.
Yeah, a lot of songwriters have mentioned that.
I'm sure. Yeah. It's funny how daunting 3 pages can seem. I mean, you read it and you're like, 3 pages a day, no sweat. I got that.
Okay, great.
And then you sit down, and as a writer, you start editing and you start thinking about content. You're like, well, this needs to go somewhere. And you're like, not the point. The point is to just do a mental dump. It's like dredging the topsoil. So like you can start from scratch or whatever. And so I'll have phases where I'll do that religiously, like daily, every morning. And it really does help. And then there will be times where I just don't, I don't do it at all. I'll go through, it's like, I don't know, maybe I need like to dam up the waters or something in my mind is how I feel about it.
Well, no, the analogy I always hear from songwriters is filling the well. Like those that don't write, those that don't write every day deliberately don't, because first of all, they say if you write every day, things become derivative and you force it. But then they say that they specifically take time off not to write, and whether it's songwriting or anything, so that they can gain those experiences and have things to write about.
Yeah. And in addition to that, that's typically also when I get back into reading as well. Like when I really am just so sick of hearing like my perspective on anything, I could care less. It's just like, and that is generally when I'm like, okay, what book did I not finish? Or like, what do I want to read about? Just get lost in someone else's, the way that they're writing. I feel like it's kind of like, I kind of kick myself for the lack of learning other artists' songs or songwriting, because I know that there's a lot to be learned that way. But for whatever reason, anytime I try and do that, I just end up trying to write my own song instead. And so it doesn't feel rehabilitating at all.
Yeah.
So I feel like reading other authors and the way they write, because like, depending on who it is, it might take you a third of the book to really even just settle into the way that they're writing. And for me, that to me is more rehabilitating than learning someone else's music. So if I'm not writing, I'm usually reading, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to ask about that in a second, but I want to follow up with the morning pages and the lists. So are these lists are they relate? I guess, do either of those things, the lists or the morning pages, do you ever go back and look for those for song ideas?
Right.
I mean,
one thing I sort of, right. One thing I sort of like gave myself a little leeway on the morning pages, because it kind of tells you like, hey, this isn't something that you should be monitoring or editing. So, but because I would eventually write something within those 3 pages where I'm like, it's almost like you see the highlighter present itself and you're like, that phrase could go somewhere. know, and I'm like, not the point of the exercise. So what I'll do is I'll underline it, and then I have my list pad on the right. So I'll just jot down that phrase. And typically I'll do them before interviews, because I think your subconscious kind of knows the through line. And it might just be buried under a lot of stuff. So I'll have my separate notepad for the list or for little like catchphrases or whatever, or maybe it's something that, you don't see coming, and 2 days later you're like, oh, that's what that was. So I kind of have them separated so that I can continue to just mentally dump in the morning pages. And then the list is for anything that once I write it down on the other pad, it's like somehow I allow my brain to just keep moving forward with the stream of consciousness thing. And then on a really insignificant level at the same time, I mean, sometimes it's just like grocery, laundry, call your mom. 3:00 is when your wife's doing this until 6, so don't be in the kitchen. Sometimes it's just little things where if I don't do that, I will completely forget up until the last minute. And then I get stressed out. So, anything from the mundane to, hey, that might be the name of my next record,
right,
can kind of go on the list.
I think that people I think people imagine songwriters are just always, these things are, the process involves no structure at all and no organization. But I can't tell you how many songwriters have told me that they have themes and lyrics organized in Excel spreadsheets. And
I remember, yeah,
Word documents. Reminds me of what you said. Like Lauren Mayberry from Churches told me she has, I think, an Excel spreadsheet with all of those words and phrases. And
yeah.
But I think so. Is that process for you? Are you a relatively organized songwriter in that sense? Sounds like you are.
Well, it's interesting. I guess I am, but not in a very modern sense. Like my wife would love it if I could figure out the word expel. I don't even know the name of it. Whatever that is, like she's been waiting for me to just like get on her level, because we'll have like certain things where it all lives there. I still have my notepad. Like even like the thing that I need to do right now is update like my insurance gear list, and I have like 12 pages, analog, handwritten out things with serial numbers, price tickets, like, and all I have to do to get this done is enter it into one of these things you're describing, and then I'm done. And I put that off for 2 weeks now. I just can't get there. But to answer your question, I guess I do have a structure. I think my brain is so cluttered that if I like to have structure so that I can then like let the chaos loose. You know what I mean? Like I'm not a very linear thinker or writer. So if I don't have like some sort of outline of where the rails are, I'll eventually look up in the middle of the chaos storm and I feel lost. And then I don't feel like I actually got anywhere. So as long as I have somewhat of a boundary set up, I will let myself play like a 5-year-old. But I think I do need some sort of a simulation of like where did I begin and where's left and where's right.
Yeah. So since you mentioned pad, I've always said I could do an entire website dedicated to the brand loyalty that songwriters have to pens, pencils, and types of paper. And I'm talking about brand of pen and color of ink. So how much does that matter to you?
Yeah, I almost wish I had such a dialed aesthetic that I could give you the brands, but I think as long as it's college rule and it's a fine point pen, I'm good to go.
Does color of ink matter?
I don't think so. Although I when I was younger, I used to. I would actually sit with red, blue, and black. And if I was angry, which I was a lot as a later teen, I would switch. It was really weird. It almost frightening. Like I would write in red, but also going from like cursive to regular to large font. I mean, it was just all over the place. And I've actually read back in my journals, and I was just like, good God, I'm so glad that kid made it out, because that's a little worrisome. But nowadays, it's usually just a fine point, black ink pen. If I'm really like, I tend to start off with somewhat of a controlled font and aesthetic. I do enjoy the look of a well-written page, but generally, about a page and a half in, my hand is tired and I just want to get to that third page, and it's just sloppy. But no brands that I know of.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Is there, for me, the writing process, I need a ritual. Like I always write in one chair, but I revise in another chair. And I think there are certain times of day that are most effective. There are things I have to have with me. To me, that ritual is super important because it just gives me confidence to know that, if it's happened like this before, it might happen again. So
sure.
yeah, how important is
the variables?
Yeah. How important is maybe it's superstition, whatever, but I mean, how important is the ritual, like place, time of day, things you have to have with you, all that stuff?
I might actually not know. I guess I think the first thing I thought of was light. Whether it's dark out, I need to have really good like warm light bulbs around me, or if it's the daytime, then I need to be near a window and I need there to be warmth, some sort of like almost like arcing up instead of arcing down type of a feeling. You know what I mean? Anytime like the light, you can just kind of tell when the energy changes in a room. I think I'm just really sensitive to like the feeling in the room.
Yeah.
And so, I generally try to time that with like a good strong cup of coffee. Or, if it's something that I am not necessarily in a seat of needing to get anything done, I'll be a little more, I'll give myself more leeway, and it's like, maybe I'll have some wine and that's sort of just more the explorative, way of writing, just to see what's out there, but not necessarily like, I don't expect to get work done that way, but I do like to tap into that every now and again. But I think I just try to catch whatever the emotional wave is as it's rising, and that could be when the light is good or when the coffee is strong. But I tend to be mostly ruled by my emotions, and that I've been learning is something to be aware of. And the question for me is, I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. And if it is a bad thing, I'm not really sure what to tell anybody, because it's been working for me.
Well, is there an ideal emotion when you tend to get your best writing done?
Yeah, I think, I guess there's kind of a few, like I have a few answers to it. I feel like the main avenue is when I am like, not drinking very much, or if I am, it's a glass or two of wine the night. And so I'm relatively calm the next day. And I've already sort of done a mental dump, some morning pages, coffee is there. I've got either classical or jazz or opera or silence, and the sun is coming up and everything is sort of lifting up. I guess that's probably the main thing, is I like to do it when everything is feeling lifted. However, sometimes it's, when you're at the bar and you're hanging out with friends and you've maybe had more to drink than you typically would, and you go to the restroom and you just have the best phrase on loop, and it's a melody and it's a phrase and it's a feeling and it's a package that just came out of nowhere. And I don't always get those when I'm writing in a very like zen place, right? So I love to pocket those little like spurts of, they're almost like venomous, and like in small amounts, they're actually quite potent, but they need to be surrounded by something that is a little more digestible, or, refrained, more harnessed. So I like to kind of allow myself to spin off and find those moments. But I've learned, at least in the last 10 years, that cannot be the main. It's just not a sustainable way of always writing. I think I used to think that. I used to really love the idea of like, I'm going to go to a bar, I'm just going to like drink, I have a day off, I'm just going to see what happens. And then inevitably you're kind of writing for like maybe 45 minutes, and then it's just garbage. But
is there a time of day when you tend to get your best writing done, or does that matter? Morning?
I think mornings. Yeah. Again, I think I used to think it was the evening, and I guess it depends. Like if it's collaborative, like, sometimes my writing lyrics doesn't really take its true form until I'm in the room with all of my band members in terms of songwriting, because there's a deadline coming, and B, when you're sort of creating the vibrations in the room that are essentially the bed of what these lyrics will become, it's just like somehow the frequencies make it very obvious. Like there's all of a sudden there's a lot weeded out, whereas if you're just looking at a blank page and the music isn't there, there are no walls. There's no limit to left, right, up, down, whatever. And sometimes that doesn't do me much good. But if I am just sort of, I guess there's so many different ways of writing in my mind. Like if I'm doing drafts, like if I need like draft 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, blah, 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 and I'm refining, morning coffee on the lift up is when I'm like probably at my best, I think, in the most honest with myself and in the quality. But if I need to like have a spark or a seed, that's generally under some kind of pressure cooker.
Yeah.
You know, in the room with other people, picking up conversations, good energy, bad energy. And I'll just kind of like try and like maybe not physically write, but mentally write as fast as possible. And I do a lot of drafts. Like I'll do most likely at least a dozen, if not 24 drafts on a song lyrically before it's finished for the world, because I like to go through different scenarios and I don't always know what I'm writing about. One thing I really loved about Britt's response was the way he was like, you know, the minute I try to write linearly, like it's over. And I'm like, that's exactly me. I mean, not exactly. I mean, we're all different, but I don't know. There's something about knowing that the emotion that I just attached to that phrase has no business coming in yet. And I don't know how to get there until I'm there. And I might not know what's in between point A and F, you know? So I just kind of have to go through a lot of drafts.
Do you need distance to be able to write about something, whether it's an event or an emotion, or are you effective writing about that thing immediately afterwards?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think in my superstitious way, I almost feel like if I don't write it down immediately, then I lose it. Like I have a tendency to maybe crank out a pre-chorus and a chorus and maybe part of a verse. And then the moment is gone. And then my superstitions kick in. It's just like, well, you better actually, I guess maybe I'm contradicting what I just said. I think what I get naturally at first, I sort of tell myself that if you push any further, those lyrics are going to start sounding contrived.
Yeah.
So put that away and don't come back to it until something inside of you says, writes, thinks something, and then you eventually realize that it's attached to that thing you were working on over here. I usually have quite a few pans, you know, on like in the oven at the same time. And they generally reveal themselves as to where they should go over time. So I guess I come back to them. And honestly, it might be, it could be a week, it could be 6 months. I've had a song last like 7 years and then it finally makes it on an album. It's the weirdest thing.
So is that something you normally do? Do you intentionally set things aside all the time, or is that only when you kind of hit a wall?
I guess if I'm being honest with myself, I get to a certain point naturally, and then I can't, and then I put it away for a little while. And I'm not going to lie to you. As soon as I say that out loud, I'm like, am I just lazy? like it makes you think like I want to be the Hemingway. Like every morning I'm going to sit down or stand up and write and finish this damn thing. I just worry that it's not going to be very good or honest. And maybe that is just me protecting my lazy habits. I don't know.
But I do think that whenever you look at something, whenever you finish something and come back later, it can be a day or it can be a week. There's always things in my writings that I noticed that I would not have noticed if I didn't give it distance, right? Very
true. Yeah, so true.
So, okay, there was a recent study I read because you mentioned the morning, and I've been talking to this about songwriters. It just came out a few months ago, but the study involves the moment right before you go to sleep and how that sits in the creative process. And so in this study, they talked about Salvador Dali, the painter, and he had this ritual where he would sit in this super uncomfortable chair with a skeleton key between his thumb and his forefinger, holding the skeleton key out over the chair. And and then on the ground, there was like a teacup or a plate or something, a saucer on the ground. And then in that moment when he just fell asleep, he would let go of the key, of course. It would hit the saucer, make a noise. He would wake up and then he would start to create because he found that moment right before sleep to be the most creative, most fruitful. And then apparently this has been validated by science. In the study, they did this with people. And there's a term for that moment, again, right before sleep. But we all have that moment where you get these weird words and phrases. So I'm curious if that's ever happened to you, maybe during sleep or in that moment right before sleep.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Salvador Dali, what a cool dude. I mean, like how he was able to do what he was able to do.
Oh, it's hilarious.
I was about to say one will never know, but it sounds like we're starting to learn how. But I mean, I definitely understand that state. I think in all honesty, I probably could capitalize on it more than I do. I think when I was single and much more or much less like anchored to a schedule, to mostly nowadays to a schedule that is dictated by my wife's work or just the reality of like, hey, it's actually better if we do the conference calls every Monday at this time, things like that,
right?
Which for a while I didn't have that parameter, and I was always all about experimenting with things like that. I guess my answer is I definitely am like, I know that feeling. And yes, maybe there's a time or two where I actually had I guess the reality, it boils down to like, okay, I'm going to get out of bed. It's going to wake up my wife. I'm going to have to find the pen and pad. I'm going to have to turn on a light. And what outweighs what, right? Like, how good is this idea? Is this idea better than, because like, I don't know, like maybe a couple of nights ago, I had to get up just to use the bathroom, and that also was annoying. So like now we have two examples where I'm getting up in the bed.
So practically it's hard to do.
Practically it's hard to do. I guess I have done that, but it's like, that's maybe when I will. Yeah, actually, this is definitely the case. Instead of doing all that, now that is when I'll go digital, and I'll just open up my notepad in my phone, or because mostly I get stuff with melodies. I very rarely just get like, I don't know how you just see it. Maybe you do. I'm a singer, so I don't usually, but I usually get it with a melody. So there's been plenty of times, and you can usually tell by the voice memo, you can tell I'm under a pillow, because I'm still in bed and I'm trying not to wake up my wife. And, I'll just sort of sing out, and there might be 4 out of 12 words that is actually good, and the rest is gibberish. And then I wake up the next morning, and, 9 times out of 10, I can't understand what I was saying. And I have no idea. There's no through line to get back to that weird state. But I do love the commitment from Salvador Dali. And
it's crazy. There's a picture and everything. You have him sit. It's got to be, he even said what kind of chair it has to be. I forgot what his words were, but it can't be any kind of chair. It's got to have some, so I want to get back to the revision because you said, you mentioned, I think you revised like 12 or 14 times or something like that. Are you changing words? I mean, I guess I worry that when I revise that much, I've lost so much of what the original intent was. So when you're changing things that often, what are you changing?
Well, I think the interesting thing about what you just said is usually for me as a songwriter, or for me as songwriting, I actually have the opposite problem. I generally start off to where it's like my drafts are there to prove, or to sort of convey, like, to a person who emotionally isn't aware of what I went through to get there. So it's my job through those drafts to actually make it make sense to someone else. Like, therapeutically speaking, I have like thousands of unfinished songs that are just in my Logic files. That to me, it's done. I love it. I get enough from it, but lyrically it makes no fucking sense. So, and I'm happy there. I'm happy to stop right there. But the world, other people who, maybe didn't take that walk I took or see that weird thing they saw, the songwriting isn't developed enough to convey, to get anyone somewhere, to get anyone anywhere. So I actually am trying to, I don't know, sort of take the field and narrow it in a way where it makes sense to the other listener. But I hear you, like you don't want to lose the original, potency of it.
Yeah.
I guess sometimes it is like, yeah, like maybe I'll notice from recording back. I use like recording a lot as a writing tool, so I can sit back and be a listener and not have to physically do it and listen. And there's typically times when I hear it back to me where I'm like, that was generic, right? Like I did that just so I could get to the next line, and I know that. So there's just tightening up of certain sections that feel lazy or a little too generic, or the opposite, where it's like, well, that's so specific that only I know what the fuck that means. And then it's just a call you make, right? Like, well, maybe I want to leave that because it's worth enough to me that it's okay that nobody knows what that means.
Right.
And it's just kind of like I make the call in those instances, but I'm like, I like to do broad strokes in the beginning lyrically, where a lot of the times it is gibberish. It's an emotion, and sometimes they're not even real words. And so I need to go back and make sure that the gibberish becomes words, and then eventually that those words match the emotion.
Yeah.
So
you mentioned Hemingway, and Hemingway once said that all writers should go to art galleries to get inspired. So I'm curious, and you mentioned, I think we started off, you talked about authors, and so I'd love to know who you like to read, who some of your favorite authors are, how often those things make their way into your songs. But yeah, who do you like to read?
Well, the irony is that I actually hated Hemingway for the longest time. I was a Steinbeck guy. I was obsessed with the detail in which Steinbeck would paint, you know what I mean? Not like figuratively speaking. And then, you know, because when you're 17, you're supposed to start reading Hemingway or 19 or whatever it is. I tried. And I think maybe late 20s is when I was like, finally, I understood. Yeah, actually, you know what it was? Is when I actually started writing with other writers who were so good at being so succinct, and there was no fat. They boiled it down to like great pop songwriters. I never really understood the art that they created in that. Like I said, I was much more of I would rather read one sentence that might be, you know, fucking 3/4 of a page, because it's so much detail that I loved.
Yeah.
And then it's almost like it was something about like just evolving or changing, where I actually found that to be a little annoying. You know, I was like, get to the fucking point, man. And so then I actually became much more enticed by like a Hemingway. I'll just leave it at that. But I think it's maybe the same with art. I think I mean, I'm still a Van Gogh fan. I love Salvador Dali. Well, I guess I was going to make an analogy, and it really doesn't make any sense. I think my artistic taste is pretty all over the place, but of what I like to see. I wish I was one of those people who went to the gallery, you know, and maybe I would enjoy it. Maybe I need to go alone. I think that's my thing, is like I can't go on walks with people. Like, they like to just like keep walking, and I'm like, well, wait, let's see what this bird's doing. Why is he doing that? Oh, there's his buddy, you know?
Right.
And you're not going to see that unless you stop. And that's annoying when you're in a group.
That's
so maybe
true.
I need to go to art galleries alone. That's probably the move for me, I think.
But when it comes to, at least I find that most songwriters, when it comes to reading, most songwriters are voracious readers. I mean, not many have said, yeah, I just don't read, you know, I don't read. So yeah, how often do you get to read? And is that, just, you know, is that it? Yeah, whether that influences your songwriting or not, that doesn't really matter. But I'm just curious, your reading habits in general.
Totally. You know, I think, I was like a late comer to reading. Like all through high school, you just could not get me to read anything. I mean, I would just take the F and move on. And then strangely enough, like, I think it was my senior year of high school, I got super into transcendentalism, like Thoreau, Emerson, and I would actually just go to school, check these books out of the library, and then I would leave, and I would go get stoned in the woods behind my parents' house. And that like opened everything up for me. I became obsessed with reading. It took me like months to read Walden because I had to use a dictionary under it. So I went from being this kid who like wouldn't even figure or finish Boxcar Children to like, I'm reading Walden with a dictionary under it and like making notes. It was a strange transition. And then I got obsessed with Steinbeck, Hermann Hesse. And then it all kind of like, when I started touring, it all became a lot more challenging for me to to like, it's almost like when you're running, you get to a certain state where you no longer, it's like mile 4, somehow you're less exhausted than you were by like mile 1.5.
Yeah.
I feel like that with reading. It's like, if I don't allow myself to get to that state, it's really, I have to reread the pages like 6 times. And when I have these broken up moments from touring, I just got there fewer and fewer times.
Yeah.
I will say though, I know this might sound less scholarly or whatever, but like the amount of songs I've started by watching, whether it's a movie or Netflix, because they're so good at matching motion to sound to lighting. I mean, I just get really moved by those scenes. And like, to be honest with you, like I've started quite a few songs from, maybe I heard a melody wrong, or, you know, I heard a melody happen. I got up to go make a snack. I'm humming it. It's not the same melody. And I realized that. And then I pick up my guitar and then boom. So I might be reading less, but at least there's Netflix.
Yeah.
It's going to be so offensive to so many writers.
No, not at all. I mean, okay. So I think the difference is 20 years ago, that's a different conversation, but there's right. Amazing writing on television that I think rivals the best reading out there. I'm with you on that entirely.
Yeah.
All right. So we have a couple more minutes. And my last question is the role of movement, because you mentioned you're a runner. I'm a runner. I've written about this in the Washington Post, the link between aerobic exercise and creativity. So I'm curious. And a lot of songwriters have told me that the role, whether they're walking, biking, running, hiking, I've heard things like vacuuming, anything, the role of movement to the process and how they get 100%. Inspired. So what is that like for you?
Yeah, well, and as I've been doing this entire call, which hopefully hasn't been too noisy, I very much subscribe to that, the attachment of motion and just kind of getting the gears moving in your head or wherever that begins. I think like we spent so much time talking about, almost like the ritual of when you write, what do you need to write with? Like I might start there, but if I'm trying to if there's that line or a missing bridge or whatever it is, I generally find that when I'm cleaning the house, when I'm like, bed needs to be made, dishes need to be done, place needs to be vacuumed, toilet maybe tomorrow, and all of that motion and just I just love things when they're in order. You're getting this, I don't know if it's a hit of dopamine or whatever it is from seeing your place become, aesthetically very pleasing. And you're also moving around. That's typically when I can finish those sentences or dial in that last word, because I'm generally singing it on repeat in my head anyways.
It's the mundane activities. That's what I hear from. It's not just the running. It's the mundane activities, like the cleaning, the vacuuming that require no brain power, when you can kind of your unconscious brain kind of takes over because you're so, you're doing those things by rote. Right. So I hear that a lot too. I've heard folding clothes and cleaning. That's can be very effective to the process.
Yeah. So. I just love, I don't think that I'm OCD, but I do love, I just love putting things in order, like a home. I love clean kitchen, happy brain. You know what I mean? I just can't. I guess I don't know. I've never lived in a very large house or anything like that. So it's once a couple things become askew, it's ugh. Yeah. You're just zigzagging and that's no fun. So I don't know, man. Cleaning is it's just so healthy. It just feels so good.
I know. I hear you. And that's it for the latest episode of Songwriters on Process. Don't forget, you can find all of my interviews with over 200 songwriters on my Songwriters on Process website at songwritersonprocess.com, going all the way back to 2010. You can read them, watch them, or listen to them. So until next time, thanks for listening.